Welcome everyone to the last panel of the Global Democracy Conference. Before we start, I want to thank very especially the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, who has joined us for the closing of the conference. Thank you for joining us. I know it was a long travel for this, so we really appreciate your presence here. Our last panel is the path forward defending democracy. As you know, my name is Aníbal Pérez. I'm the director of the Kellogg Institute. And we have a wonderful panel to discuss the impact and the different ways in which activists, political actors, institutions can help contain the backsliding of democracy, and also how is it that universities can collaborate with this process, both in terms of research and in terms of hosting people. And to engage in this conversation, we have a fantastic panel. I will go in order. Our first presenter is going to be Laura Gamboa, who is assistant professor at the University of Utah. Not for long, because she will be joining the Keough School of Global Affairs this summer. And she was a visiting scholar at the Center for Latin American Studies in Harvard University this year. She's the author of the book Resisting Backsliding: Opposition Strategies Against the Erosion of Democracy. Next to Laura is Jennifer McCoy, who is Regents Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University. She served as director of the Carter Center's Americas program between 1998 and 2015, and she was named a 2024 Andrew Carnegie Fellow. She has authored or edited 6 books and many articles, and her latest volume is Polarizing Politics, A Global Threat to Democracy. Next is Kurt Weyland, who is the Mike Hogg Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. He has published 10 books and over 40 articles. His most recent book, published this year, is called Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat, Countering Global Alarmism. And last but not least, we have Zerxes Spencer, who is director of the fellowship programs at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. And in this role, he oversees the Democracy Fellows Program and the National Endowment for Democracy's efforts to support Democrats at risk, working with journalists, activists, human rights defenders, scholars, and others under attack around the world. So as you know, the questions today are: what strategies are most effective to protect democracy from processes of autocratization? Can we help identify those strategies, and in which way can we provide useful knowledge or safe spaces to defenders of democracy? Each speaker will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and I will give you a sign when it's time. Laura.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Today I'm going to present a little bit of my book and some of the reflections I've been doing for this past year, kind of hearing the research that many other people are doing across the world and more recent cases of democratic backsliding. I think about the erosion of democracy as a type of regime transition that happens over time. Like civilian or military coups, the erosion of democracy pushes a regime outside the democratic camp into the authoritarian camp. Unlike civilian or military coups, however, the erosion of democracy happens over time. And this has to do a little bit with what was discussed in the earlier panel about sort of how costly it is for leaders today to throw a coup, right? So I think about potential autocrats or presidents with hegemonic aspirations as democratically elected leaders that want to achieve a series of radical policy goals, and kind of institutions are kind of noise for them. They would rather not have them, right? And so they would do a coup if they could, but it's really costly, right? And this is costly because of, and I'll talk about this later, domestic and international normative preferences for democracy. Now, because the erosion of democracy happens over time, I posit in my book that the opposition has ample opportunities to fight back. So if you think about a coup happens, the opposition runs to the embassies, right? With the erosion of democracy, the opposition still has seats in Congress, they have influence over the judiciary, they have a space and time to fight back. And to do that, they can have 2 goals. They could either aim to push the executive to resign, right? Like this legitimately, democratically elected president or prime minister, they can just push that person to quit or remove them from office. Or they could just try to push back against specific anti-democratic reforms. To do this, they could use institutional strategies, Congress, courts, or elections, or they could use extra-institutional strategies, which is anything that does not use Congress, courts, or elections. And when you combine strategies with goals, this is kind of what you get, right? I would usually go into detail in this table. I'm not going to do it today, but I hope you all get an idea, right? You have moderate strategies with moderate, institutional strategies with moderate goals would be anything that uses institutions to push against specific reforms, whereas extra-institutional strategies with radical goals would be things like coups or guerrilla warfare that clearly try to push an executive out, but they could also be protests, boycotts, or strikes that are trying to push the executive to resign. Now, these different strategies and goals, I believe, have different consequences for regime outcomes. Extra-institutional strategies with radical goals, I argue, are a very risky gamble for the erosion of democracy. If you think about these executives come to power as legitimate presidents. They were legitimately elected. So trying to use extra-institutional strategies to push them to resign can increase sort of the popularity of the executive. They can allow the executive to rally around the flag and push against these efforts. And I use the case of Venezuela to exemplify this. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez comes to power in 1999, and the opposition, even after Hugo Chavez instituted the Constitutional Assembly, even after the sort of 2000 elections in which he pretty much reshaped a lot of elected bodies, even after sort of the decrees of 2001, in which he actually gained a lot of extra control over a particular set of mostly private goods and another set of powers, even then the opposition had ample opportunities to fight back. They had 48% of the seats in Congress, a very strong presence in PDVSA, which is the oil company in Venezuela, sympathizers in the armed forces, supporting courts and oversight agencies, the support and control over major media outlets, and the ability to mobilize millions of Venezuelans to the street. But using a coup in 2002, they allowed Chavez to legitimately purge the armed forces. And then, using an indefinite strike via PDVSA, they gave Chavez the legitimate reasons he needed to purge PDVSA from managers and sort of middle-managed people and pretty much replace 60% of those people with loyalists. Last but not least, in 2005, the opposition launched an electoral boycott against Parliament, with which they lost their presence in Congress because Chavez got an almost 100% Chavista National Assembly in 2005. But later on, because they had control over the National Assembly, they lost the support of courts and oversight agencies and media outlets and so on and so forth. By 2006, 2007, Venezuela could no longer be called a democracy, or not even an imperfect democracy. It had become a competitive authoritarian regime. The other case that I look into my book is institutional strategies with moderate goals. These would be, of course, using Congress, courts, or elections to push against specific anti-democratic reforms. And I use a case of Álvaro Uribe to exemplify this. Álvaro Uribe was a potential autocrat, and for those that may or may not believe me, I have an extensive discussion of why it's the case in the book. And he tried to undermine democratic institutions, he tried to get reelected, he tried to undermine the courts, he tried to increase his powers of decree. Yet the opposition against Álvaro Uribe did not use extra-institutional strategies with radical goals. They actually used institutional strategies with moderate goals, and to a certain extent, extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals as well. In doing so, they were able to protect their seats in Congress. Let me just show you for a second. The opposition to Álvaro Uribe was not nearly as strong as the opposition to Hugo Chavez. They had less people in Congress. They had some supporting courts and oversight agencies. They had the ability to mobilize people, but not as much. They did not have support inside the armed forces, nor did they have support of the media outlets. Yet, by failing to use extra-institutional strategies with radical goals, they failed to provide Álvaro Uribe with the legitimate reasons he needed to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them. And therefore, they pretty much, by the end of Álvaro Uribe's government, they were able to protect the resources they had and use them to push against specific anti-democratic reforms. There are two other cases, and it kind of depends, right? You can have institutional strategies with radical goals, which would be impeachments and recall referendums, and they can work really well in some cases in which an impeachment can actually stop a potential autocrat, but they can also work not so well when a recall referendum, for example, just empowers the executive. You could also have extra institutional strategies with moderate goals, which again could work really well. This is a picture of INE's, sort of the protest to protect INE in Mexico. But they could also not work so well. This is a protest of the Honduras protest against the re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, right? In which they kind of delegitimize them, especially not because the protest is planned as violent, but because we don't have the mechanisms, we don't have the kinds of organizations that allows us to prevent protests from having fringe violence. And so these autocrats use the fringe violence to sort of crack down on the opposition. And then here are kind of the new cases. This is a picture of Guatemala this year. And what I have found out in these new cases is really maybe, and I wish I could rewrite this part of the book, we should start thinking about this jointly, right? What we see in Guatemala is a fantastic example in which you have a very clear institutional strategy. They were running for elections. And then they use the streets in support of that particular strategy. And that seems to work really well. Another good example of that would be Israel pre-October 7. These are strategies and goals. In the book, I discuss other cases. I discuss the case of Turkey. I also discuss the case of Poland as kind of how the theory works. Now, there's two important conditions that we need for this to happen. The first one is we need a democratic starting point. Venezuela in 1999 is significantly different from Venezuela in 2006 or Venezuela in 2024. We cannot ask Venezuela in 2024 to use institutional strategies with moderate goals because the institutions are just not available, right? And so I think when we think about these strategies and goals, we also need to think about the stage in this process. In my case, I'm talking about that stage, when you still have some institutions available. Then the second one is the international or domestic audiences with a normative preference for democracy. I think this is key. The only reason the autocrat is not launching a coup is because there's pressure and consequences for him to do so. A great example when this did not happen is Nayib Bukele. Nayib Bukele was able to erode democracy in half the time than Hugo Chavez. And he was able to do so because the international community did not respond aggressively and quickly against clear abuses of power. This is a picture of Nayib Bukele the day he walked into Congress with the armed forces. He was threatening a self-coup. And yet, the OAS and the United States have a very weak response against it, right? They did not condemn it. They did not react with the strength, which of course sends the signal to Bukele that he can do these things without getting penalized for it. And I think then that if the international community is weak or does not have a very strong normative preference for democracy, and I'm gonna quote, and I think this has a lot to do, especially in Central America, with immigration problems, right? Very much like in Africa, sort of the United States especially is very wary of enforcing this normative preference for democracy because they wanna keep immigrants in Central America. So I think when this happens, then these autocrats get the wrong lesson from it. And so Nayib Bukele just became incredibly more abrasive. It of course helped the fact that a couple of days after this, COVID exploded, and so we had a problem there. So just to kind of conclude, oppositions can defeat potential autocrats, even strong ones, using the right kind of strategies. But to do so, they need audiences with a normative preference for democracy. And in doing so, doing so is significantly easier at the beginning of the process of democratic erosion than just later on in the process, which is why you need to catch this on time. The lesson from El Salvador, it was significantly easier to stop Bukele in 2020 than it is today, right? Today is an uphill battle. In 2020, it was kind of an easier task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Perfect timing.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about defending democracy in the face of pernicious polarization and democratic backsliding. Yes, there it is. And I'm just going to draw on research I have done with a number of different collaborators and different projects on both backsliding and on political polarization. And I'm going to make 5 points about that. Thinking about what do we need to do to defend democracy in these circumstances and try and draw some lessons in just a few minutes. So the first is, and Laura has talked about this, but we start with the recognition that backsliding is different from democratic collapse of the past. And I want to make this point because in part of this debate that we talked about yesterday on the Measuring Democracy panel, and that I think that we're often talking past each other in this debate over, is backsliding occurring or not, or is there a democracy threat in the world? When some researchers are looking at democratic collapse and some are looking at democratic erosion. So I'm very concerned about democratic erosion, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. But democratic erosion or backsliding is different from collapse of the past due to regime uncertainty, that people are not certain where exactly the regime is. Even the things we've talked about in the side halls today, earlier was Ecuador under Correa authoritarian or democratic? When does Venezuela turn democratic? There's a lot of uncertainty because of this very process. And it also presents a lot of collective action dilemmas for the oppositions to react. I'm working on a project with Murat Somer to look at some of these questions. But some of the lessons learned, I want to point out, would be first, on the first point, is that we do need to pay attention to erosion, not just collapse, because we care about the quality of democracy, whether or not it eventually fails to survive. And of course, we know that it can deteriorate to the point of entrenched autocracy. Generally, the main lesson is that the populace, as well as political actors, and we as intellectuals, as academics, as well as practitioners, need to pay heed to early warning signs and act quickly, because waiting dramatically increases the chances of authoritarian entrenchment. That is, timing is everything. Laura just made this point as well, and this is coming clear in a lot of research. Now, one strategy, and this is my second point, one strategy that is often recommended, and I have done this, many people have done it, is for the political actors in an election competition to unify in a pre-electoral coalition, a broad coalition, cross ideologies, to challenge an eroding or backsliding incumbent. So this is often a recommendation made, and it seems to be the most effective electoral strategy, but it's extremely difficult to carry out. And I wanted to look at this a little bit more systematically. So with some colleagues from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, we just did kind of a simple exercise of looking at cases in the last decade, so from 2013 to 2022, to see what actually happened when oppositions formed coalitions or didn't. How did they do? So I just want to show you a little bit of those results, I think. There we go. Okay. So this first one is we counted 82 cases, electoral episodes, where the incumbent or incumbent party or incumbent leader, if they were going for re-election, had been backsliding. And then we looked to see, did the oppositions form a coalition or not? And so what we could see from that count was that when they did form broad coalitions, they had a 50-50 chance of winning, while when they did not, they won only a quarter of the time. Then we looked, and this one's a little bit more complicated because a couple of things are going on, but we also found that they have a much better chance of winning at all during mild or moderate backsliding. And so this is the key about trying early in the game to do this. And they don't win at all once backsliding is severe. once there's been a great deal of backsliding. This is not the level of democracy. This is the amount of backsliding depending on where one starts, the percentage of backsliding. So if you're starting up in a pretty full, liberal democracy, you can have a lot and still be down to in an electoral democracy. Okay, so I want to make this point different. But they are, so this is the point here. They still have a much better chance of winning it all, and particularly with coalitions in this slide. The problem is they wait to form the coalition until it's late. And because it's, it's natural, they want to show their party chances and survival early on when they still think that they do have good chances to win. Once they realize that it's going to be extremely difficult to challenge this incumbent, then they say, oh, well, maybe we do need to form this broad coalition. But by that time, the conditions are so bad, it's very, very difficult to overthrow them, or to, win. So, looking at that, we have also concluded that the media environment is extremely important, the information environment. And this also came out of some of the panels yesterday, looking at the role of media. And so we wanted to look at this, and we can see that it is very hard to win in a poor media environment, where the media is closed to opposition, so the space. And finally, now the quality of democracy, the level of democracy in this one. We can see that in high quality but backsliding democracies, oppositions still have a 50-50 chance to win, okay? In more authoritarian elections, at the lowest level, they have much less of a chance, but we still have a couple of examples. Gambia in 2016 was the outlier with the lowest level in our sample of democracy, but there was international intervention. But we can also cite Honduras in 2021 and the Maldives in 2018. All three of these had coalitions. Now, my third point that I want to move to is the indeterminacy of backsliding. The outcomes are highly contingent on a variety of conditions. And here, I'm going to draw in part on a comparative project that I did with colleagues, one of whom is here, Rachel Riedel, somewhere here, I'm not sure, and a group of scholars that we did for a USAID project. And here, we looked at 15 comparative cases of some backsliding, but then recovery, and then an intermediate level of backsliding, and then those that had really gone down to the authoritarian entrenched level. And we found that the intermediate level was highly unstable. It's an unstable equilibrium. And they could either recover or they could deteriorate fairly quickly. In fact, two of them, right in the middle of our project over a couple of months, actually deteriorated and fell down during that time period, Benin and Tunisia. The fourth point is about the trap of polarization, and drawing on some of my work on political polarization, also with Sommer. And we know that democracy, that polarization is often over democracy itself. And democracy eroders, one of the characteristics is that they claim to be Democrats or to be deepening democracy today, even when they're eroding it. So they're making democracy claims, and they're accusing their opponents of being traitors in some way, whether that is a socialist or communist or simply traitors to the country. While, of course, the Democrats, the small d Democrats, are saying that the democracy eroders are the ones eroding it. So this clash of perceptions and claims about who is the real enemy, what is the actual threat to democracy, is one of the main sources of political polarization today. So I did another exercise with a colleague at Carnegie Endowment. So these slides come from pieces that are published on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website, if you're interested. In this one, we counted between 1950 and 2022 52 episodes of pernicious polarization, that is, democracies that reached very high levels, toxic polarization, for at least 2 years. And we wanted to see what happened. And so you can see of these 52 countries that those who did manage to depolarize, to come below that level, stayed stable in their democracy regime category, and none of them downgraded, whereas those who stayed at high levels of pernicious polarization, how many of them? 10 were able to kind of maintain stability of their regime category, but 26 were downgraded. This is in the VDEM regime categories. So, the pernicious polarization is a problem. And we've learned various lessons looking at different cases. Positive, emotional, and unifying appeals are sometimes effective in campaigns. Rights and democracy cleavages are sometimes effective. I would point to Lula's campaign in Brazil. However, we also know that in Hungary and Turkey in 2022-23, simply appealing to democracy and integrity was not enough. And here we might turn again to what Oliver Stunkel talked about yesterday and what Michael talked about this morning with the USA idea as trying to make the point about what democracy can do for the daily lives of people and showing performance. For the US, I have some other work showing that another thing we really need to do is to move to looking at the incentives. And for all of these, what we want to do is move from a win-lose perspective to win-win perspective. So get out of the zero-sum perspective. For the United States, the minoritarian institutions, particularly majoritarian election systems, are very much a win-lose kind of system and incentives that we need to change. And finally, the last point, the dangers of impatience. Reversing entrenched democratic erosion is a long, slow slog. So when we're talking about Venezuela, Nicaragua, we've talked about others, or even when we do see the dramatic removal of incumbents, as we have seen in a few countries, Poland, Guatemala, US and Brazil as well, it's precarious and it's often reversed. So lessons learned from those, we need party development and groundwork. We need parties need to use local elections and compete every time. And Turkey this past year has great results from that after losing terribly last year. And because they've got to continue to build their organization and ties to their voters. The need for broad sectoral coalitions, bringing in private sector, other coalitions, and the need for courageous leaders to bridge divides. And to be, the last thing I'll close with is for the parties and the political actors in particular to be ready to take advantage of opportunities that may arise very unexpectedly. I mean, you never know when somebody's going to die or something else, or a military coup, as we've seen. But also the changing scenarios. And here I think the Venezuelan opposition now, in these last few months, has shown incredible adaptability and savvy in taking advantage and not going back to their original moves of just overreaction of a maximalist position, but of adapting and staying in the game. So there is still the possibility of July 28th, we might see an election in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Kurt.
So we heard an uplifting message from Laura that namely what matters is the agency of the opposition. If they make the right choices, they have a good chance of blocking democratic backsliding. If they make the wrong choices, then the chances are much lower. Would be a great message to end this conference because the defenders of democracy can make a real difference. But the organizers made the mistake of inviting me. And my recent book unfortunately suggests a very different perspective, namely that so I looked at 40 different populist chief executives and tried to investigate the conditions under which they can actually strangle democracy. And opposition choices and tactics, unfortunately, didn't really come up as a factor that made a difference. If you want to look at agency, my findings suggest you need to look at the agency of the populist chief executive. They come in with momentum, they have electoral mandates, they have the powers of incumbency, they can advance and put a lot of pressure on democracy, and in the situations where democracy is especially in danger, they can limit the choices of the opposition. The opposition often doesn't have that much of a choice anymore. The second thing is, my findings suggest that agency isn't the best starting point in the first place. I think we can start with structural, objective conditions to understand when populist chief executives destroy democracy and when they don't. And I think there are two structural given conditions that are really decisive. Populism I define as personalistic plebiscitarian leadership, big leaders that rely on plebiscitarian mass support. So if you are a power concentrating leader, the weaker the pre-existing institutional framework is, the more chances you have to advance. That's a given pre-existing factor. Institutional strength or weakness is a condition for you to advance and be able to do a lot of damage to democracy. Second, the plebiscitarian part. For you to have, as a populist leader, a lot of clout, you need overwhelming mass support. And you can get that overwhelming mass support if you can benefit from two types of objectively given conjunctural opportunities that are opposite in many ways. One is what you see with Hugo Chavez and his friends, which is a massive hydrocarbon windfall. We have big gains that you can distribute. You can practically buy mass support. And with that mass support, you can put a lot of pressure on democracy. The second objective condition is the opposite. An acute, severe, but resolvable crisis like hyperinflation. And when you face that kind of issue and you can resolve it, you're the hero. You're the Salvador de la Patria, and a ton of people will like you, like Fujimori. So, in my view, it's those two types of factors, institutional strength or weakness, and then these conjunctural opportunities that account for the cases where democracy falls to populist leadership and where democracy survives. So, and in the book, what I show is that these two types of factors combine in different ways, different levels of institutional weakness, different types of conjunctural opportunity, combine in ways that can account for the way democracy dies in the three types of populism that we know: the culturally conservative right-wing populism in Europe, the left-wing Bolivarian populism in Latin America, and the right-wing neoliberal populism in Latin America. So look at the neoliberal populism in Latin America. They governed in presidential systems of middling institutional strength. So to overcome the checks and balances that those systems pose to their power hunger, they needed really exceptional conjunctural conditions. Alberto Fujimori, he faced massive hyperinflation, he faced a brutal guerrilla insurgency. Fujimori made big headway against both of those things, and he had massive support. So when he did his self-coup, when he pushed through a new constitution, when he went for re-election, the opposition could make absolutely no difference. The guy had 81% support for his self-coup. Nobody could really oppose him. So then you have cases where not all the conjunctural conditions are given. You had Menem in Argentina, hyperinflation, but no guerrilla war. You had Uribe in Colombia, who had a guerrilla war, but no hyperinflation. They were pretty successful, but they had to negotiate with established political forces. They couldn't just close Congress, push through no constitution. They had to negotiate, make concessions. In those cases, the opposition does make a significant difference. And in those cases, because you have an institutional framework of middling strength, the opposition can make good advances by working through the institutions, using conventional means, using moderate strategies, because there is an institutional framework, there's middling strength, and that gives them a bastion, a basis to work on. So it's in those middling cases where the opposition, I think, is really important. Then you have a bunch of cases, like Fernando Collor in Brazil, faced hyperinflation, couldn't get it under control. You had other cases like Bucaram in Ecuador, who didn't face hyperinflation, but governed as if he faced a crisis. These leaders didn't get a lot of support. They were politically weak, and opposition forces booted them out in a variety of different ways. Impeachment, formal in color, Boko Haram, some weird machinations. The type of strategy and tactic that the opposition used didn't really make a difference. But you can argue in many ways. A number of those leaders were evicted, but it wasn't that important for the fate of democracy, because the callers and Boko Harams, they were weak anyway, and they wouldn't have made very much damage to democracy in the first place. So you can, in some sense, say the opposition managed to boot them out, but that was not really decisive for saving democracy. Okay? So now look at the Bolivarian left-wing path. So Hugo Chavez becomes president in a country that suffers from high instability. 2 military coup attempts, a politicized impeachment left the Venezuelan institutional, constitutional system really weak, really tottering. So Hugo Chavez comes in, he immediately pushes for a constituent assembly, he packs the constituent assembly, gets a tailor-made new constitution, he closes the established Congress. After he reopens a new Congress, he rams through a whole bunch of decrees, he doesn't consult. What were the options of the opposition in that situation? Hugo Chavez didn't respect institutional checks and balances and constraints. Essentially, in my reading of the Venezuelan case, the opposition didn't have a realistic choice of making a real difference by working through the institutions. So, what are your choices in that very constrained situation? Collective abdication. Even Ermakov wrote a book about that. You just give in. Or contention. So they chose contention, and they almost booted the guy out. We forget that a number of the contentious means they used really pushed the guy to the wall. He was actually deposed for a couple of days. And so extra institutional strategies that the opposition chose in despair, because I think they didn't have realistic ways of containing the guy, almost made a difference. Chavez only emerged from those near-death experiences. He would have lost the recall referendum probably if he hadn't been benefited by an exogenous factor, namely the upsurge of the global commodities boom right in 2003. So Hugo Chavez, when the opposition called for a recall referendum, his population was low, he would have lost. The commodities boom kicks in, the economy recovers, he rolls out his social programs, his popularity increases, he stalls with the recall referendum for more than a year. When the recall referendum finally is held, he wins. So when the second condition for the destruction of democracy in that Bolivarian path kicked in, the combination is high instability in a battered institutional framework and a massive hydrocarbon resource windfall. When that kicks in, Hugo Chavez is invincible and nobody can really make a difference anymore. You see the impact of that second factor with Evo Morales. Evo Morales gets elected at the height of the global commodities boom. He faces opposition, he forces down the opposition uses different types of means, doesn't make a difference because in an institutional system with high instability, 2 prior presidents had been booted out in problematic ways. Bolivia, very weak institutional framework, global commodities boom, the opposition can't really make a real difference for the longest time. They get some concessions in the constitution, he just disregards them, wants to get re-elected, moves forward. What happens? The global commodities boom ends in 2014, and Evo Morales' popularity declines. People are also sick and tired of the guy. So in the 2019 election, the opposition can fight him to an electoral stalemate. He tries to steal the election. You guys from the OAS played a crucial role in calling his effort to conduct fraud. The opposition resorts to protest. The opposition quickly escalates the protest to demand of booting the guy out. And you know what? The extra institutional strategy worked. They got rid of the guy. And so you see, they ended his competitive authoritarian regime in contentious extra-institutional ways. You see that contentious extra-institutional means can have worked in a number of cases. I don't have time to go into the East European cases. The guy who got just shot last week, Robert Fico of Slovakia, he was booted out by mass protests in 2018. Extra-institutional strategies can end the pressure on democracy that populist leaders bring. So, what I'm arguing then is that what is decisive is not opposition agency. The types of choices that the opposition makes are often constrained. They often don't have good choices. The Venezuelan opposition, in my reading, under Hugo Chavez in 2002, 2003, didn't have good choices. They only had bad choices. What matters is what the populist leaders do with their clout, with their, depending on their plebiscitarian mass support. If they find the combination of institutional weakness and plebiscitarian mass support, either based on massive gains and hydrocarbon windfalls or based on resolving really acute and severe crises, in the cases where those conditions combine, fortunately, in my research, I looked at 40 cases, only 7 cases that actually happened, only 7 cases, democracy died. But in those cases, the opposition can't really make a difference. The opposition makes a difference in the middling cases, where some of the conjunctural conditions are there, but not all, where the conjunctural condition either isn't there yet, like with Hugo Chavez early on, or it has passed with Evo Morales. There, the opposition can make a difference, but the opposition can use a variety of tactics. Clearly, it's better to start trying out, considering institutional, conventional strategies that are clearly better, they're clearly less risky, but the opposition doesn't have to stay with it. If they face a situation like Bolivia in 2019, where Evo Morales tries to steal the election, they move to protest, they demand booting the guy out, and he falls. And so that is what my book tries to demonstrate, that what matters is the populist, and what matters especially are the structural given conditions that shape the clout and the force of the attack of a populist leader on democracy. So, thanks.
Today, Helena reminded us of how important it is to have inclusive conversations when you have a conference about democracy, which was a very important point. And I think your presentation reminds us that we need to be inclusive in terms of the people we invite to our universities and how essential this is to support democracy around the world. This has been a fantastic panel, closing panel for our conference. I have so many questions for this panel, but we have about 15 minutes for questions, and I suspect that many people in the audience will have similar questions to the ones I would like to ask. So I think I will save my questions for dinner, and I will open the floor for questions from the audience. Please, before you ask your question, I would like, please introduce yourselves, but before you ask your question, make sure that you have a microphone, because otherwise the people who are following online cannot hear you. So Tom, please.
Thank you. My name is Tom Mastillo. I'm a professor here in the Keough School, an associate professor. And my question is for Kurt, or really anybody willing to react. So I'm grateful that you interjected, structural conditions into the conversation. At Notre Dame right now, we're obviously, having a conversation about how to build programming and how to raise funding to, address these issues. And I think that there tends to be a kind of a bias in favor of, in favor of interventions that are, quick, and feasible, I guess. So it kind of lends itself to agency-oriented kind of explanations and interventions. But, what can get lost, I think, are these structural underpinnings, the way in which we can, operate on them or not. So I guess I would like to ask you, with respect to the questions for the panel, I guess, for the session, what can we do? Do you see like a roadmap forward for intervening to alter structural, what can we do as a community of scholars and practitioners gathered here, for example, to operate on this kind of situation? Thanks.
I suggest we take another question and then we have a round of responses. Kunle?
Thank you. Kunle Owolabi, Villanova University. So this was fantastic, and we heard two very different kind of accounts and explanations about kind of the rise of electoral autocracies and what can be done to stop it. I found them both extremely persuasive. I've read Laura's book and talked to her many times. I'm hearing Kurt's account for the first time, and on face value, also finding it extremely persuasive. And I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about some of the cases outside of Latin America, because I think there are some underlying conditions that make Latin America really unique for studying this topic, right? So like one is the fact that you only have presidential systems. Another one is that you have a lot of economies that are heavily dependent on like natural resource exports, right? You also have a region with, by global standards, very high levels of violence and insecurity. And you also have a region with global standards that has had some of the worst inflation crises. So some of the structural conditions that you mentioned, Kurt, are particularly pronounced in Latin America. And you mentioned when talking about the book that there's, you also looked at some cases outside of the region, and I know Lara does as well. So I do want to hear a bit more about how do some of these things play out in the spaces like Hungary, right, Poland, right, maybe the Philippines or Turkey, where some of those underlying scope conditions, either the institutional or the structural ones, are not the same. They could be quite different. Or you might have a different cultural context as well from Latin America as well. I'm like genuinely really interested in this, and I do find both compelling. But what happens when we move away from Latin America and look at other parts of the world?
I think I'll answer Kunle's. I'll leave Tom's question for Kurt. I find that my argument works in other parts of the world. I think institutional strategies with modular goals helped a lot in Poland, particularly sort of, and I think Poland could be one of those cases in which you have extra institutional strategies and institutional strategies working in tandem, especially towards the end with the elections. I think they work. It works well in Turkey as well. Actually, Turkey has a wealth of examples of radical institutional strategies and radical extra-institutional strategies that provide a lot of evidence of the kind of consequences I'm talking about, which I want to say is not. My book does not say, well, if you use institutional strategies, 100% you're going to stop the autocrat. But I do claim that you're going to make it harder, significantly more costly, right? Than if you just launch yourself with extra-institutional strategies and radical goals. I think Hungary is one of the cases in which the predictions does not fulfill, and I discuss it in the book why. But I think some of the reasons overlap what I explained about El Salvador, right? I think part of the reason why in Hungary sort of time didn't work in the benefit of the opposition was Orban's willingness to just forget about his democratic facade. He couldn't care less if he appeared authoritarian because there were no consequences for Orban appearing authoritarian because he had the backing of Black Knights, and this kind of aligns with what was said in the Africa panel. He had the backing of authoritarian powers, right? So I think if I had to say, one of the things that I think, again, key is sort of this international setting, and I think that maps very well with what was said in the Africa panel. It's just this international setting and sort of the incentives leaders have to keep or not keep a democratic facade. That's what I would say.
So the conditions are really regionally different. And so what I actually do in the book, I look at Latin America, I look at Eastern Europe, and then I look at the United States. And I say the United States, a lot of that concern about, oh my God, American democracy is so fragile, I think is way overblown. Because when you apply my argument to the United States, you see great institutional strength, and you don't see the volatility that is really underlying these conjunctural conditions. You're not going to have a massive windfall in the US. The US economy is way too complex, and you're not going to have a massive crisis. Even COVID, actually, the compensatory spending was so high that average incomes increased. So I think developed countries are really quite safe. Eastern Europe, less so. Eastern Europe, you have a parliamentary system that's actually open to more legal change. So like Orban in Hungary, dismantle democracy, destroy democracy in perfectly legal ways. Every legal thing. So what I emphasize in the East European cases, you have a level of institutional weakness that's higher than the presidential systems in Latin America, but not as high as in the high instability cases like Venezuela. So what is crucial there is whether you have a sharp economic recession. So Orban, sharp recession in 2008, he wins a supermajority in 2010, and he can completely legally dismantle democracy. Many people saw the Hungarian case and the Polish case is very similar. I emphasized in the book that the Polish case is very different because you didn't have a sharp economic crisis. They didn't win a supermajority, they win a bare majority. They couldn't dismantle democracy in completely legal ways. They did it in kind of pushing and shoving and tricks and manipulations. So that prompted a lot of protest. I finished the book in mid-2023, and thank you, the polls confirmed my argument by voting the guy out of office. So here, out of sample prediction, wrong, one for me. So, and you see in the East European cases, you don't have many of these sharp economic crises. So the argument has some two very basic factors, but in somewhat different versions and different combinations. And I have to say, I myself was surprised. I looked at 40 cases. I have essentially two basic factors, and I was like, wow, this really works out quite beautifully. What's going on there? So now, what do you do about it? Of course, the structural factors are very, very difficult to address, right? So you're not going to change an economy that is highly dependent on like oil and that is therefore susceptible to a huge windfall, or an economy that is highly susceptible to like hyperinflation. You're not easily strengthening the institutional framework. So if you want to work on the underlying conditions, that is a very slow, long-term, very difficult process. I think what you want to do is you want to use that kind of framework to say, where can opposition make a real difference for the fate of democracy? And I think that is in these middling cases. A case like Bukele, forget it. I mean, Bukele, 85% support. He addressed COVID as one crisis. He addressed the crime problem as the other crisis. Opposition can make absolutely no difference in Bukele. You want to spend money on the Salvadoran opposition, it's testimonial, give them scholarships to get out of the place, but making a difference, no chance at this point. And then there are these cases where populist leaders are weak. You know, the Bucarams, the Gutierrezes, the Colos, the whole bunch of people. You don't have to worry very much because even, you know, think of like Pedro Castillo in Peru. High instability in the institutional framework. Pedro Castillo comes in, makes himself go up, within 2 hours, poof, out. So when populist leaders are really weak and the conditions are not fulfilled, you don't have to invest in that either. They're going to fall by the wayside anyway. What you want to focus on is the case of like Uribe, the case of Menem, the case of Evo Morales after the end of the global commodities boom, where domestic opposition and the OAS came in and said, don't steal that election. And there, it's different types of opposition strategies that can make a difference, depending on the strength of the institutional framework. Institutional framework, middling, strong, Argentina under Menem, Colombia under Uribe, go with your institutional strategy. Evo Morales, you try to fight him in the election, and then you move to protest, and then within a week you say, get out. And they pushed him out, and it worked.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, maybe. Elena?
Mexico. Scott Mainwaring was the only one who consistently mentioned us. A populist, extremely polarizing, weak media, opposition reduced to rubble, trying to get together in a coalition which is very weak, high levels of crime, and a booming economy, a neighbor that cares about stopping migration before anything else. Are we doomed?
So the explanation.
Wait. We want to take another question. Jana, please. We will need to wrap up soon, so that's why I want to collect a few questions before.
Thanks. Jana Morgan, University of Tennessee, visiting fellow at Kellogg this past year. My question's primarily for Jennifer. In your comments, you talked a bit about how the sort of pro-democracy forces have a different understanding of democracy than their opponents, and how there's more of a maybe plebiscitarian understanding of democracy among the populist opponents. And I guess one thing I'm wondering about is how, in context where democracies are not historically done a very good job of being inclusive of large majorities of the population, how it's perhaps not terribly surprising that people who don't feel like they've been part of the democratic project in a serious way might have a different understanding of democracy and be less concerned about the protection of the rights of privileged minorities, and more so in numerical minorities, and more concerned about the power of the voice of the majority, and sort of how do we adjudicate between two different ways of thinking about what democracy's primary goals should be. Should they be about protecting rights, or should they be about articulating the views of the majority, and how do we balance those things?
Yeah, and I have comments on the first question too, and on Kurt's presentation, both their presentations. But anyway, I will say, I want to say generally, agency, institutions, and structures all matter. And I mean, I don't think anybody is saying, I argue for agency a lot when we're talking about polarization and what happens with democracy. Agency is key, but the facilitating conditions are institutional as well as resource-based. But what they do, and what I think is critical for both, I mean, you guys are posing yourselves as if you're, opponents, but it's not really.
Professor, I have to clarify.
But it's what really matters is interaction of incumbents and opposition. It's the interaction. You're not listening because I want to say something to you.
Interaction.
It's the interaction of the incumbents and the opponents. And your example of Venezuela is wrong. At the beginning, yes, they had institutional weakness. The political parties were decimated, but they still controlled half of the military, half of the police, half of the Supreme Court, and half of the legislature as people were defecting from the Chavistas after the 2000 elections. Before the 2000 elections, Chavez had no legislature. So there was institutional strength by the opposition. They chose in 2002 a part of them, not the whole opposition, to have a maximalist condition of a military coup that then came in and did not promise an election right away, but in maybe a year in the future. Very maximalist response. They had an opportunity to negotiate after that, while they still had institutional strength, with the OAS, the UN, and the Carter Center, and they basically chose not to take advantage of that. So there were choices of the opposition at that point, early on. But also, it obviously depends on what the incumbent is doing. And what Orban does with a legalistic strategy backed by great EU funding, yes, is very different than what others are doing that are more clearly egregious. Okay, so I just want to make, there's a lot more points in there that I would love to make if we had time. In terms of Jana's question, so, the other thing is, this whole thing about institutional, extra-institutional, I find very confusing, because I think you've changed, Laura, your definitions of them over time. You had like protest and referenda as extra-institutional at one point, and now sometimes they can be institutional. I'm not I'm a little unclear on that. Protest can be certainly constitutional, and so, you know, there's some things. But the strategies chosen and the way they're viewed changes over time as the context changes. So what may be seen, what Marat and I are calling it is extraordinary versus ordinary strategies, and that this can make a difference. Extraordinary strategies may be needed when politics is no longer normal, the normal democratic. And so whether that's institutional or not, it's kind of a different question. Jana, the problem of the perceptions of democracy is who is accusing who of being a threat, threatening democracy. And yes, populists are going to use a majoritarian, more plebiscitarian approach to it, and some liberal Democrats are focusing too much on the liberal side, absolutely correct. But what I was talking about really more was, and Andreas Schedler is writing about this too, how people are perceiving each other and the claims they're making. So they're really clearly anti-democratic, you know, refusing to recognize elections, you know, not even a majoritarian perspective, but clearly anti-democratic perspectives and claims is what's coming into conflict here that we have to address.
We need to wrap up, so please 1 minute if any of you would like to address any question.
In the Mexico case, 2 words, no re-elección. You can't be re-elected. Every populist wants to be re-elected. That is the real descent into authoritarianism. No re-elección in Mexico. The guy is finished within a few months, and that protects Mexican democracy. On the Venezuelan case, it protects Mexican democracy, right? On the Venezuelan case, I disagree. I mean, Hugo Chavez comes in, he has a constituent assembly, 95% of the supporters, he manipulates the electoral system, so he has 95% of his supporters in the constituent assembly. He then has elections, yes, the opposition has resources, yes, they have representation. Hugo Chavez doesn't care. Hugo Chavez, on the last day of his decree powers, he rams through 49 decrees. The opposition says, please, let's negotiate. Please, let's take it to the Congress. Please, let's have a debate about it. Hugo Chavez said, no, I'm going to ram it through. So as the old discussion on the notion of power said, resources doesn't mean power. They had resources, Hugo Chavez just disrespected. Show me one time where the opposition with an institutional move really reliably and sustainably limited what Hugo Chavez did. Hugo Chavez disrespected everything. You have resources in the opposition, I just ram it through. So I have a very different reading of the Venezuelan case. The opposition, yes, they had resources, but they had no promising option for reining the guy in with conventional institutional mechanisms. You either have collective abdication or you go out and try to push the guy out, and they almost managed to push the guy out. And Venezuela might have been a lot better off if they had succeeded.
Thank you, Kurt. We need to start. Clearly, we have much more to discuss here. And certainly we will do over dinner. We need to start at 5:30 sharp because Secretary Almagro has a flight to catch. So we will start at 5:30. You have 5 minutes, and then if you want, and please come back so we can start at 5:30. Thank you.